Hello. In this talk I'm going to be thinking about how to defeat a Crusader army. And I'm going to be thinking about this particularly from the perspective of the Seljuk Turks, or indeed the other Turkish armies which the Crusaders encountered on the battlefield. And a quick note before we get started: by Crusader I am talking not just about the armies of the actual Crusades, but we'll also be thinking about the Frankish armies that were deployed by the Crusader states, which are the series of territories established along the eastern Mediterranean coast by the armies of the First Crusade. So, how do you defeat them? Well, let's begin by thinking about what an army from Western Christendom looked like in this era, with a few thoughts about how those armies evolved between the First Crusade and the fall of the Crusader states in 1291. Well, the first thing to say is that Western Christendom, and indeed the Crusader states, these are predominantly agricultural societies. And like agricultural societies, their armies reflect their way of life. So just as in an estate you might have various farming families with then a knight or a local lord who owns the land, so armies are organised in very similar ways, with elite knights who have the best equipment, horses and heavy armour, and then wider formations of infantry drawn predominantly from artisan or farming families. So the army reflects society. Now, the most heavily armoured warriors in Western Christendom's armies of this time would have worn chain mail, or even better, double thickness chain mail, which would be enough to ward off all but the strongest blow. And then underneath that chain mail they would typically wear a padded jacket, and the purpose of that padded jacket is to absorb the impact of a major blow. So if, for example, you were hit with a mace that wasn't intended to cut through armour, the padded jacket underneath your chainmail would absorb at least some of that impact. And so that's one major area of strength for Frankish armies. They're heavily armoured. And the knights are extremely well mounted on very, very well trained and reared war horses who have been specifically conditioned to enable the knight to act as a shock troop. So in squadrons, formations of knight would charge at their opponent, the idea being that their enemies would break on impact, or even better, would break before impact, and then they'd be able to carry on going, breaking down other opposing formations as well, and they could be very effective at that. Now, as for the infantry formations, they would be armed with weapons such as spears or bows, but then as the 12th and 13th century goes on, these infantry forces would also be equipped increasingly with crossbows. I mean, crossbows are present throughout this period, but they become much more frequent, and crossbowmen become deployed in much larger numbers as this time period goes on. Crossbows have the disadvantage that you can only shoot a few bolts every minute, as opposed to a bow, which you can shoot far more frequently. But crossbows have a very long range, and a crossbow bolt can pierce most forms of chainmail armour. So there are a number of strengths there. But there are other qualities in a Frankish or Crusader army that could also be weaknesses. Firstly, Frankish armies of this era were heavily dependent on logistics. Wagons carrying food, ammunition, and in some cases water, and they needed to maintain their supply lines to friendly territory. So that's a potential weakness. Frankish armies could also be slow moving because they've got very large numbers of infantry who can only move at a walking pace, naturally enough. Now, various things do change over time. For a start, Frankish armies get a great deal more disciplined, and we'll look at the reasons behind that in a little bit. And they also become equipped with better armour and better weapons as time goes on. I've mentioned crossbows already. Armour seems to have got thicker, although notably during both the 12th and early 13th century, the Franks didn't tend to equip their horses with armour, also not metal armour, and it's only really towards the end of this period that you get occasional references to horse armour, which again could be a potential point of weakness. So let's now think a little bit about the Seljuk Turkish armies, or any of the other Turkish armies of this era. And what makes the confrontation between Crusader or Frankish armies and Turkish armies so interesting is that they fought in fundamentally different ways. For Turkish armies, their origins lie in the Central Asian steppe country, where from a very early age people are raised to ride, to shoot, to hunt, and these have very obvious military applications. So armies from steppe regions often have enormous mobility because they're all mounted. They're very effective with the bow, and they're used to working in concert using hunting strategies that translate very easily onto the battlefield. And in addition to these various strengths, the various Turkish armies have various stratagems that they typically deploy, which can work very well. One of those stratagems is to feign flight, and that's where you give the impression that your army has been routed and is fleeing. And the idea is that you're seeking to persuade your opponent to charge towards you, thinking that you're broken, and therefore trying to pursue you and cut you down, but in fact the whole thing is a bluff. Because having fled a certain distance, your army then reforms, turns, and then stages a counterattack on your opponent as an opponent charges towards you, and it can be very effective. But there are weaknesses to Turkish armies as well, and one of those weaknesses is that Turkish forces tend to be fairly lightly armoured. There are various forms of armour that Turkish warriors wore, particularly leather armour. It seems very likely that some would have bought better quality armour or acquired chainmail as the decades went past. But typically Turkish armies, whilst they're all mounted, their horses tend to be a great deal smaller than the mounts used by Frankish armies. So they can only maintain a certain weight before it becomes too great for them. And so Turkish warriors tend to be less heavily armoured than their Frankish opponents, and they also seem to have been less well suited for hand-to-hand combat, at least in part because they are less well armoured. So let's now consider the encounter between these two very different types of army. On one hand, you have the Frankish armies, slow moving, heavily armoured, suited for hand-to-hand combat, with some archers, but increasingly deploying more and more crossbowmen as this period develops. On the other side of the battlefield, you have Turkish armies, far more mobile, fast-moving cavalry, but more lightly equipped, but with strengths in the sheer number of their archers, who are very accurate and very effective in ranged warfare. So what happened in the various wars and battles between these two different types of armies, and how in particular did Turkish armies overcome their Frankish opponents? Well, a key word here is attrition. Turkish armies rarely tried to confront Frankish armies head on. What they typically tended to do was to stage a series of probing attacks, small companies of mounted archers charging up to within a short distance of the Frankish army, loosing a few volleys of arrows, causing a few casualties, and then wheeling away and getting out of the way before the crossbowmen could shoot back, and just keeping that going. And so you're wearing your opponent down. Now that's not just a process of attrition. By constantly surrounding Frankish armies, wearing them down with these attacks, you can also cut them off from their logistics. As we know of many examples, including the armies of the First Crusade or the 1101 Crusade, for example, where Turkish forces constantly maintained pressure on Crusader armies, trying to wear them down, but also cutting them off from their supply lines, preventing people from reaching the Crusader army, and then when the Crusader army sent out raiding parties, then focusing on those raiding parties to make sure they never made it back to the Crusader lines. And so by this process of attrition, and by cutting off their supply lines, the idea is that you will slow them down until eventually they break. And this could work very effectively. An example which kind of shows this is a campaign waged by the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1147. And in this year, King Baldwin III of Jerusalem advanced with his army against the town of Bosra, just to the south of Damascus. And the Franks had been told that the local governor was in rebellion against the authorities in Damascus and would therefore side with them. So the Frankish army marched out towards Bosra, and immediately it became hedged in by the Damascene army, which didn't try and block its path exactly, but just continually maintained its attritional attacks, wearing the crusading army down, preventing it from reaching water, preventing it from receiving supplies or communications, until eventually when the army did reach Bosra, the Franks were in no position to set up a siege and simply had to return back to their own territory. And so that's another example of attrition being used as a way of defeating an army. It's actually quite rare in this period for you to get two armies lining up and facing each other and then staging a big battle in the middle of the battlefield like you might see in a Hollywood film. Battles of this era can last for many days, just constant attacks wearing down a Frankish or Crusader army until it breaks or withdraws. I've already mentioned the strategy of feigning flight, pretending to withdraw your forces to then try and encourage your opponent to break ranks and charge after you before turning on them and attacking them back. Well, this happened very effectively in 1119 at a battle called the Battle of the Field of Blood. And in this particular battle, there were various Turkish commanders on one side of the battle, led by someone called Ilgazi, and on the other is the forces of the Principality of Antioch. And this is exactly what happened. Turkish forces feigned flight, the Frankish cavalry pursued, not supported by the infantry, and were then trapped and defeated before the Turkish army then moved against the infantry. So it can be a good way of dividing cavalry from infantry and defeating each one separately. Another similar strategy occurred towards the mid and late 12th century when an army representing Nur al-Din, ruler of Syria, confronted King Amalric of Jerusalem in Egypt. And on this occasion, the battle took place in the desert to the south of Cairo, and the Frankish army deployed, Nur al-Din's army deployed, and then when the Franks staged their charge at Nur al-Din's army, which was led by someone called Shirkuh, what Shirkuh did was simply to separate his forces in the face of the Frankish charge. The Franks then charged straight through the middle of Shirkuh's army, and then when the charge lost its impetus, Shirkuh's forces then closed in upon the cavalry forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army and defeated them. So this can be a very effective strategy, but you can see that what Turkish commanders are really trying to achieve here is to defeat Frankish cavalry, because they're the most dangerous part of the Frankish army. And there are various other strategies that commanders used specifically to defeat Frankish knights. Another one occurred in the 1120s in northern Syria, when a commander called Balak was fighting a party of knights from the county of Edessa. And Balak led these knights on a very long pursuit, always withdrawing before them until he brought them to an area of very muddy ground. And he positioned his forces on the other side of that muddy ground. So when the Frankish knights charged through the muddy ground, they all started to sink. And that then caused their charge to lose impetus. And then it was easy for Balak to defeat them in battle. So there are various different ways of defeating Frankish cavalry, but notice how these various approaches seek to avoid meeting Frankish heavy cavalry head on. Many of these strategies are to do with separating the cavalry from the infantry, or waiting for their charge to lose impetus, or to cause that charge to misfire in some way before only then closing to bring about their destruction. And so you can see that many of these strategies focus on the defeat of mounted knights. And it's for this reason that Turkish forces often focus their efforts, particularly with their archers, on shooting down Frankish horses. There's no need for them to focus on the rider or on the infantry. If you can shoot down the horses, then you prevent the Franks from staging their cavalry charge, and this can then bring about their ultimate defeat. Other things that Turkish commanders did, and later on Kurdish rulers such as Saladin, is to substantially increase their ranks of heavy cavalry. Now, at the time of the First Crusade, there were some Turkish commanders who did have heavy cavalry forces, but there seems to have been a process whereby Turkish rulers self-consciously developed large squadrons of heavy cavalry alongside their mounted archers, which would give them the ability to meet Frankish heavy cavalry on equal terms. And it seems that a crucial factor in Saladin's defeat of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187 was his development of large numbers of very heavily armoured troops who could meet the Franks in hand-to-hand combat, and this was a crucial factor in his victory in that particular battle. Okay, so this has just been a whistle-stop tour in various strategies and approaches used to defeat Frankish armies. Do watch the other videos in this collection.